My name is Rebecca Allen. I'm the head of education at the Bard Graduate Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you tonight to Modern Magician, Calder's Circus and the Invention of the Mogul, a conversation between Joan Simon and Jed Pearl. Tonight's program evolved out of a conversation that I had months ago with Jed about the rich artistic milieu of Paris in the 1920s. And so tonight we temporarily leave the Circus in New York City and the gallery exhibition down the street that was curated by Matthew Whitney, and we revisit France in the early 20th century. As Alexander Calder certainly understood, the circus encapsulates our dreams and magnifies our fears. It puts us at a safe distance from danger and offers us the possibility of becoming bigger, stronger, more exotic, and more beautiful than we actually are. As a spectator and as a documentarian of the circus in his own way, Calder took all of that power and squeezed it down into his diminutive circus figures and equipment. The concentration of energy and motion within Calder's circus created a different kind of transcendence in those who witnessed it over the years, and which I think we will all experience in some way this evening. I am so pleased to introduce Jed Pearl, who is an art critic who has written for the New Republic since 1994, a recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Academy in Rome, and the Leon Levy Center for Biography at City University. Jed is the author of books including Paris Without End, Eyewitness, New Art City, and most recently, Magicians and Charlatans, Essays on Art and Culture. And you will see Jed's new book in the lobby on the table there. So those books are for sale. I'm sure that Jed would be willing to sign for you if you'd like, from Aiken's Press. And Jed is currently at work on the first full-length biography of Alexander Calder. And Joan Simon is an independent curator, writer, and arts administrator. As curator at large for the Whitney Museum of American Art, she co-organized Alexander Calder, the Paris years 1926 to 1930, in partnership with the Centre Pompidou. Joan is currently at work on no less than 3 major projects: a retrospective exhibition of the work of Lorna Simpson to open in May of 2013 at the Jeu de Paume, a book on the work of the artist Joan Jonas and her 40-year career as an artist, and a project on Oliver Ranch in Sonoma County. Welcome to you both. We're going to start with Jed's presentation, and then Joan will give a short presentation, and then the two of them will sit and have a conversation. I'd also like to welcome our friends from the Whitney Museum and special guests from the Calder Foundation tonight, and thank you very much for being with us. So Jed, let me get your film going here.
We just thought we'd start by showing a brief excerpt from a 1955 film that Calder did performing the circus. Now, you just got to remember when we look at this that he's more than a quarter century older than he was when he first created and performed the circus. So this is about 5 minutes. very much, Rebecca. Thrilled to be here. I hope you've all seen the show, the circus show down the block is really tremendous. The Calder Circus is really an enormous subject. There have been books written about it. Joan curated a very important show a few years ago. And I want to talk briefly, and what I thought I would do is ask 5 questions, raise 5 questions about the circus and about its relationship to Calder's work and to the period, the early 20th century. The first question is, how did the Cirque Calder come about? And this is actually rather mysterious. The photograph on the left is Calder, 1927. Our story really begins, it's hard to find a beginning to the story of somebody's life, but we'll start in 1923. Calder is 25. He has decided to become an artist. He has been living out west in Washington State with his sister and her husband, and comes back to New York, and he is living with his parents. His father, Sterling Calder, is a very well-known sculptor. His mother is a serious painter. He's living with them in the village and beginning to take classes at the Art Students League. He's already gone to college, studied engineering. He's had a number of years of some odd jobs. He wasn't sure what he wanted to do, but it seems as if he's decided on a career as a painter. Now, one of the big questions for him at this point is, how is he going to make a living? He had grown up in a family of artists, and he knew how hard it was. His father was very well known, but despite that fact, there were often times when making ends meet was not simple. Within a year or so of starting at the Art Students League, Calder is beginning to get jobs doing cartoons, illustrations of one kind or another. And what you see on the right is one of a series of marvelous groups of vignettes that he did for a paper called the National Police Gazette. And what he did was he would examine an aspect of the pleasures or entertainments of New York City. There's a group of vignettes devoted to Central Park. There's one about Coney Island, various kinds of sports events. And he would gather them together. There's generally a central picture. In 1925, he goes and studies for a couple of weeks the Ringling Brothers Bar and Bailey Circus. He does this illustration. He, later that year, actually goes down to Florida. He's interested in the circus. He goes down to Florida to draw at the circus in its winter home in Florida. And out of these pictures, out of these drawings, these cartoons and illustrations, come paintings. The painting on the right is a circus scene from 1926. Calder does all kinds of scenes of life in the city, the streets of the city, again, entertainments in the city. Matthew Whitman, in the catalog, Matthew Whitman, the curator of the show, in the catalog, talks about Calder's drawings of the circus in relation to the work that the Ashcan School had done, the artists of the Ashcan School had done a few years earlier in New York, again, a popular entertainments. And the work you see on the left is a 1903 painting by Everett Shinn of a trapeze act at the Winter Garden Theater. And indeed, the connection between Calder and the Ashcan School is actually very close, because Calder's parents had studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, and among their fellow students were John Sloan, William Glackens, and Everett Shinn, who did this painting. These people were all close friends, and in fact, Calder, as a boy of 10, 11, 12, played with Everett Shinn. Everett Shinn loved toys and gadgets, and Everett Shinn, visiting the Calder family, their home a little bit north of New York, helped Calder with his toy trains and rig up some special apparatus for his toy trains. Calder studied with John Sloan at the Art Students League. All of these people, Sloan, Shinn, Glackens, had done illustrations of one kind or another as a way to make money when they were young artists, and Calder was directly following in their footsteps. In 1926, Calder, he's been studying in New York for 3 years, painting, and he has the yen to go to Paris. Makes perfect sense. His parents love Paris. His older sisters have been born in Paris. He knows a lot of people in New York who've already studied in Paris and been back and forth. And his parents are supported. They are going to give him a small monthly stipend. What did I just do something?
To the keyboard, Jen?
Yes, but it's not now. I press something.
Okay.
All right, okay, good.
You know what, this is bothering me,
That's all. Okay.
just because it looks like you're in an awkward.
Okay.
You're in pain, are you in pain?
Give her a hand.
So in 1926, Calder goes to Paris. He has a little money from his parents. But one of the big questions for him, again, is how is he going to support himself in Paris? And what is in Calder's mind when he gets to Paris? This is a rather mysterious question. Calder was never one to explain himself fully. And up until the time he turns 30, 31, 32, he's also somebody who I think tends to back his way into big decisions in his life. His decision to go to engineering school, when he was in high school, was always like, oh, there was a friend who was going to engineering school and I thought maybe I would go too. It's always as if he's not sure exactly what he's doing. My suspicion is by the time Calder gets to Paris, he's feeling a little dissatisfied with the kind of paintings of everyday life that he's doing. But he probably doesn't know what else he's going to do. He also knows he has to make money. Not too long after getting to Paris, he's again doing little illustrations. He does illustrations for a magazine called the Boulevardier, which is an English language magazine published in Paris for English-speaking tourists and English-speaking residents of Paris, which is sort of modeled on the New Yorker. He does things for them. He talks to somebody about maybe doing prototypes for children's toys that would then be produced. A plan like that eventually, a couple of years later, comes to fruition. And he gets a little apartment. This is still 26. He gets there in the summer. In the fall, he has a little apartment. It's really a room in a hotel on the Rue de Guerre in Montparnasse. And there he starts making things, making circus figures, making animals out of wire and cork and pieces of fabric and all kinds of stuff. And I think that although he may not exactly know where this is going, I actually think among the things in his mind are that he may be able to somehow make some money with this stuff. Because as I'll talk about a little bit later, in Paris at this time, in music halls, dance halls, cabarets, there are all kinds of weird performances that are part of the show. And I think he thinks he may have a way into that. And indeed, he's in his little room, and one of his friends, who's an editor at this magazine, the Boulevardier, comes to see some of these little toy circus elements, these miniature circus elements. They're not really toys, but these miniature circus elements that he's putting together. And this friend brings a man, a writer, who writes under the name Legrand Chabrier. He's a man named André Legrand. Now, André Legrand is a man who writes about cabaret shows, circuses, nightclub acts, that popular, sort of high popular entertainment. And Legrand Chabrier comes to this little room. Now, this is actually a photograph taken by the great photographer Cortege a couple of years later, 3 years later. But he comes to this room, and he just sits on the bed, which is the couch, and Calder pulls out of various places in his room, studio, these objects, and begins to fiddle with them. And André Legrand is mesmerized. And I had actually hoped originally to show a real clip from this 1955 film here, but it turned out when we got the PowerPoint here, the video wasn't working, so that's why we looked at what was the sort of odd excerpts from the film a little bit earlier. And so actually I should probably just stick with this image. And Legrand Chabrier is astonished by this tall, kind of interesting, odd-looking young American guy, and who's making these funny things. And one of the things that Le Grand Chabrier says a couple of years later, he writes a number of times about Circus. He comments that it's not just the elements in the circus, it's not just the performers, it's not just the animals. What really makes it come together, he says, he said, it comes to life under Alexander Calder's hand, at once powerful and caressing, but only if that contact is established truly between him and you. So in other words, the circus is not just about these elements. The circus is about watching this big, kind of charming, but somewhat, in some ways ungainly, young American man manipulating these elements. And it's the dynamic there that is so fascinating. One of the points I want you to keep in mind is that the early writing about the circus, and this is the first extensive writing about Calder. There have been 1 or 2 words published about him, maybe 2 or 3 words published about him in New York before he comes to Paris. But this first writing about him is not by an art critic. Okay, it's by a man who's a critic of the popular theater. Okay. The other thing I think it's important to keep in mind is, within a very brief time, Bohemian Paris is becoming aware of the circus. Even before Calder goes back to New York for a spell in 27, Jean Cocteau has been to see the circus. Okay, and then at the end of the 20s and early 30s, the circus really becomes this calling card to Bohemian and avant-garde Paris. And it's hard to remember now that for many, many years, the circus has been one of the central attractions of the Whitney Museum in a case, that up until 1968, the circus had never actually been exhibited as an object in a museum. Okay? The circus was only seen when Calder took it out of the suitcases to perform it. And that was mostly, the preponderance of performances, I think, were in the 30s and early 40s, and then there are fewer in the 50s, and the last one, we think, is in 1961. The second question I want to ask is how the Sir Calder fits into the larger story of the relationship and the interests of artists in the circus in the late 19th, early 20th century. This is obviously an enormous subject, which I'm going to discuss only briefly. The painting on the left is a painting by Milton Avery from 1939, Three-Ring Circus, which is actually in the Bard show. Again, the Calder's circus scene from 26 on the right. As you all know, the artist's fascination with the circus goes back well into the 19th century. On the left is Seurat's Great Cirque, his last painting, one of his last paintings, done in 1890-91. I think Calder may well have been interested in Seurat. There was an important Seurat show in New York while Calder was studying here at the Art Students League. This painting was not in the show. I don't know if he knew this painting in reproduction. The painting on the right, of course, is Picasso's Great Family, the Saltimbanques from 1905. And Picasso's fascination with harlequins and pierrots and circus goes on throughout his life. This is the curtain from the great production Parade, a collaboration of Cocteau, Satie and Picasso, the curtain by Picasso and the American and French managers, the American manager on the right. These are characters, and the horse in the center from the Picasso, Cocteau, Satie Parade. What was the fascination of artists with the circus? Very, very briefly, I think the fascination of artists with the circus has to do with a kind of double nature of what they saw in the circus. The circus, on the one hand, is a very, very ancient craft. And especially more in Europe than America, there's an awareness that the art of being an acrobat, trapeze artist, all of this goes back to Greek and Roman times. This is very, very ancient. The idea of moving beautifully with one's body. The clowns, the jokes and comedy of the circus For Europeans and to a lesser degree for Americans, there's a consciousness. This goes back to the Commedia dell'arte, which goes back to the Renaissance, and indeed some of those figures can be traced back to Roman times. So on the one hand, the circus is this very, very ancient artisanal activity. It's an ancient craft, an ancient way of using the body in an artful way to amuse, to entertain. On the other hand, by the late 19th century, the circus is the great example of kind of populist, large-scale, democratic entertainment. And I think the thing that fascinated artists, modern artists, was this doubleness of the circus. Because think of the modern artist. The modern artist, on the one hand, is doing also a very ancient thing, practicing kinds of art that have been practiced since time immemorial. On the other hand, the modern artist is facing the challenges of this large-scale populist democratic society. And I think artists saw in the circus and in the circus performer somebody who was navigating, in a sense, this ancient artisanal practice and this modern democratic world at the same time. And I think that's very definitely true of Calder as well. Again, here on the left, this page from the National Police Gazette. On the right is I don't know, I suppose it's either linoleum cut or wood cut, I'm not sure, from a small magazine called Hue and Cry. It was published in Woodstock, New York in 1925. This is a circus scene by a man named Carl Walters, which I'll come back to for a minute in just a second. The fascination with the circus in New York, it's not Calder's alone, it's also not visual artists alone. Edmund Wilson, the great critic, who was writing about the popular arts for Vanity Fair in 1925, he wrote about exactly the trapeze artist, Miss Lightsoul, that Calder in the same year is drawing here. And Edmund Wilson says about her in Vanity Fair, in the very same month that this is published, he celebrates her as, quote, the freest, least self-conscious of performers, and the performer most distinguished by style. Okay? So part of the interest that creative people, whether artists or writers, have in the circus is, here is this mass popular art that involves serious considerations of artistic style and practice. Now, if you think about the trajectory of Calder's career, I think you can see how, in a sense, this double nature of the circus would be so important to him. Because if you think of the entirety of his life, here he is, he's an avant-gardist, he's a radical artist who discovers radical new forms of sculpture, who creates radical new forms of sculpture, who at the same time achieves an enormous popularity. And in a sense, by the end of his life, he is juggling these two elements, the ancient artisanal practice and the demands of a large-scale democratic art form that these artists were juggling. My third question, what exactly is absolutely unique about Calder's engagement with the circus? So I want to go back for a second. The print on the right from this magazine Hue and Cry, the Hue and Cry magazine published in Woodstock, New York, many of you know Woodstock, New York. Two of the people very involved with Hue and Cry were a couple, married at the time, two artists, Peggy Bacon and her husband Alexander Brooke. Peggy Bacon has become quite well known as a kind of caricaturist in the period. Calder lived for a time, while he was at the Artistic League, in Peggy Bacon and Alexander Brooke's apartment, okay? And there are a lot of elements in this magazine, Hue and Cry, that are circus-oriented, and I can't doubt that Calder saw the issues of Hue and Cry. Anyway, he's living in their apartment, and they have young kids. And their young kids have some elements of a toy circus that had begun to be produced in 1903 in Philadelphia, called Schoenhut's Humpty Dumpty Circus. Okay. Now, we don't know exactly, we know at least one or two of the elements that they had because Calder recalled that they had an elephant and a mule, but the circus was produced over a period of decades. There are hundreds of different elements. But years later, when Calder was asked about the generation of the circus, he talked about working with Schoenhut's toy circus with the Brook kids, and how he, as he recalled, took some of the elements and rigged them up so that a clown could end up, for instance, on the back of an elephant. Now, when you look at the elements of Schoenhut's toy circus, it's very interesting because the whole deal about Schoenhut's toy circus is that the Schoenhut family had developed a special ball-bearing mechanism. So the Schoenhut elements, in much the way the Calder circus elements can move in all different kinds of ways, these pieces could move in all different kinds of directions and could be put together in all different kinds of ways. And when I was looking at this stuff, I was thinking, well, the more you look at the Schoenhut toy circus, and then it's a big collecting theory. There are a lot of Schoenhut toy circus aficionados, and they talk about its marvelous mingling of industrial production and a folk art element. And the more I was thinking about it, I was thinking, well, what did Calder add then? You know, here he is in Paris, remembering playing, working with, using the Brook Kids Schoenhut toy circus. But when you turn from the Schoenhut toy circus to an element in the Calder circus, here's Mr. Loyal, the ringmaster, what you realize is that what Calder has done is take some of the central ideas from Schoenhut's toy circus, and what has he done? He has abstracted the toy circus. He's stripped it down. He's conceptualized it. So rather than the Schoenhut's attempt to sort of make a figure that looks like a kind of lifelike doll, in most cases, what Calder has done is give you this kind of skeletal, conceptualized element. And here I think you have a very important key to what the circus means in the larger trajectory of Calder's work, and a key into something that is happening. I don't even think he quite knows as he's working on the circus, and by the way, most of the elements in the circus are put together between 1926 and 31. I don't think he even knows exactly where he's going. But what he's doing is taking the kind of movement he sees in the Schoenhut circus and conceptualizing it, abstracting it. And of course, that is a process that is going to be central to Calder's work. Here on the left, you have a work called The Brass Family from 29, 3 years after he started with the toy circus. And then the right, you're jumping 7 years later to an abstract work called Tightrope. And you can see how one of the kinds of processes that goes on again and again in Calder's work is the abstracting, the conceptualizing, the stripping down of movement, of action, of forces. And somehow in the movement from the Schoenhut toy circus to the Cirque Calder, he finds a key to that. My fourth question. Now, what is the relationship between the Cirque Calder and other unconventional forms of performance in the early 20th century? I mentioned before, the first extensive writing about Calder by this man who goes by the pen name of Le Grand Chabrier is writing by a critic of the performing arts, okay, not of the visual arts. And I think one of the things that has sometimes been missed in thinking about the Cirque Calder, because we're very focused on the connection to the circus, is that in the early part of the 20th century, avant-garde experimental puppet shows and marionette shows of all kinds were enormously popular. And indeed, if you read the early accounts by Le Grand Chabrier and others of the Calder circus, although the elements are not manipulated as we think of a marionette or a puppet being manipulated, in fact, in almost all the early accounts, the Cirque Calder is referred to as a puppet show or a marionette show of one kind or another. And if you look at a book published in 1920 called The Book of Marionettes, the author, Helen Joseph, observes that literary puppets afford pleasure in the artistic salons or in semi-public productions throughout Paris. It would be vain to attempt to mention them all. They are of every type. And I think indeed that Calder, in beginning the circus, has in mind to somehow get into this, I don't know if you want to call it a racket or whatever, to kind of join up with these people. And indeed, in 1927, in Paris, Calder writes back home to his parents that he has seen a show like this, a puppet show for adults, which he describes as an enchanted evening, a ballet of toy dolls, with scenery, music by Chopin, which was great fun. And indeed, if you look at the Cirque Calder relation, for instance, this is a photograph from this 1920 book of a production at the Cleveland Playhouse of a marionette show of a marionette play by William Butler Yeats, the great poet, called Shadowy Waters. This kind of very sophisticated show of small figures was very, very popular this time, and it's involved with all kinds of questions about trying to break out of the naturalistic theater, trying to find a different kind of theatrical event to present to people. And if you follow, I want you to just follow with me for a minute the thought of Calder and marionettes. Indeed, there is at least this one case of a wire sculpture of Josephine Baker that Calder does in 1927. Here in a 1929 photograph, he is manipulating this from a single string as a marionette. And this whole idea of the relationship between a person and if you will, an impersonation of a person, a marionette or a puppet. This is a very ancient idea. This is a print by Hokusai, 19th century Japanese print. And some of you may have seen Bunraku Puppet Theater. Anybody here seen Bunraku Puppet Theater? Where the people who manipulate these large puppets are actually on stage with them and seen. And this whole idea of the relationship between living people and abstracted, conceptualized people, there's an enormous amount of thinking about this in the early part of the 20th century. There's a man named Alfred Kranborg, who was a poet, playwright, and editor, lived in Greenwich Village. Calder could well have crossed paths with him, who went across the country with puppet shows in the 1920s. And in his autobiography, Troubadour, he comments that people see and guess a great deal more than puppets are able to. People see and guess a great deal more than puppets are able to. Otherwise, they are equally helpless. And out of this mutual helplessness comes that curious bond that lifts a man into an actor or a doll into an animated reproduction. And that kind of dynamic, I think, is exactly what you're seeing in the Calder Circus, with Calder manipulating these little conceptualized figures and bringing them to life as he sort of becomes their servant, in a sense. Now, the whole idea of the marionette has a fascinating and deep history in the Romantic period, which I won't go into, but there's an essay which some of you may know by Kleist called On the Puppet Theater. And the basic idea there is that the string, the one central string, as Calder is holding Josephine Baker up there, that string is somehow attaches this puppet, this artifice, to some kind of sacred essence of what being is. So the puppet, Kleist argues, can often be a more perfect, a more profound performer than a living actor. And if you start to think about marionettes in relation to the mobiles that Calder will do a couple of years later, ideas definitely begin to form. Because what is a mobile really but a kind of abstract marionette? These are some English marionettes, and these images on the left are all from early 20th century books about puppetry and marionettes. Calder sort of is aware of Indonesian shadow puppets, And there is indeed, the great mobile on the left is Eucalyptus from 1940. And indeed, there was a whole tradition in the avant-garde. This is a metal shadow puppet used at the Four Cats, the tavern in Barcelona where Picasso got his start. And shadow puppetry, both in Barcelona and at Le Chat Noir, the great hangout in Paris, shadow puppetry was a fascination of the avant-garde, inspired Degas and Lautrec and all kinds of artists. And I think this idea of the manipulation of these forms is there behind. There's no question in my mind at this point that it's there behind the mobiles. Finally, what is the larger significance of the Cirque Calder in the whole trajectory, and the Cirque Calder, I should say, and the Cirque Calder as theater in the whole trajectory of Calder's art? Calder came from a family that was immersed in the theater. His father, although he became a sculptor, had loved the theater as a kid and considered being an actor. The Calders went to theater all the time. Calder, while studying at the Art Students League, worked at the Provincetown Players, the great avant-garde theater in Greenwich Village. He worked with he was an assistant to a stagehand for the theatrical set designer Cleon Throckmorton. These are photographs of productions of Eugene O'Neill plays by Throckmorton. Moon of the Caribbees on the left, which I think is pretty clear Calder was a stagehand while that was on in 24. On the right is Cleon Throckmorton's production of The Hairy Ape, 1922, which I feel pretty confident that Calder saw. I know his family saw a production of The Hairy Ape in Washington State. And one of the things Throckmorton is doing is breaking with the naturalistic theater through very dramatic lighting. And this dramatic chiaroscuro that turns the whole stage into a kind of abstract pattern. And this whole question of getting away from the naturalistic theater was very, very much on people's minds, on avant-gardists' minds, in these years when Calder is in New York as a young painter and then in Paris. And I think that this is a work from 1936, Snake and the Cross. I think that the shadow play, and especially some of these works that almost have a proscenium arch quality from the 30s, may well hark back to the experience of these dramatic theatrical performances that Calder was seeing in the 20s. But even beyond this, the whole idea of a theater that escapes from naturalism was very much in the air. Edward Gordon Craig, a name Calder surely heard, the great theatrical designer, a name he surely heard in the circles he moved in the village in the early 20s. This is a design by Craig for a 1911 production of Hamlet, getting away from the naturalistic stage. On the right is Calder's setting in 1936 for a composition for voice in either piano or small orchestra by Satie, Socrate. And the elements, this is there are no photographs, as I understand it, of the original 36 production at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, but this is a 1977 reconstruction that was done in New York. And the elements on the stage actually were key to move in relation to the three movements of Satie's composition. And interesting, Craig was fascinated by marionettes. He actually published a couple of issues of a magazine called The Marionette. And he said that marionettes are actors, but better than actors. They have the soul of dramatic poets. And again, I think that's the kind of thing people sometimes feel about the elements in the Calder circus. The story does not end here. As in 1968, when Calder is 70, okay, he grabs the opportunity to do an abstract dance performance on the big stage at the Rome Opera House, a work called Work in Progress, My Life in 19 Minutes. And for an artist at the age of 70, enormously successful, to go to the enormous effort and trouble of creating a thing like this on stage, I think bespeaks his abiding love for the circus, for the theater, of which the circus is just one dimension. Finally, just going back a decade, in 1955, when a friend of Calder's, a Venezuelan architect named Carlos Villanueva, asked Calder to do a work for outside of an auditorium in Caracas. Calder said, no, I want to be inside the auditorium. And Calder did the acoustical ceiling for this auditorium. So I think the more you look at Calder's, the full trajectory of Calder's career, I think you see that the circus, of course it has enormous freestanding power, but it also radiates in all kinds of directions as a part of the larger puzzle of what he's doing as an artist over a period of more than half a century. Thanks a lot.
Set up the equipment. While it's warming up, one important question: has anyone in the room seen Calder perform the circus?
I mean, originally or in?
Not in the film, but live.
No.
Because one of the things that we'll talk about is part of the documentation of the circus is to talk to anyone and interview them who has seen the circus, so we could put together the many variations.
I've never seen it.
No. Sorry, this is being a little bit slow. Well, I was going to start by saying how lucky I am. One of the greatest pleasures and surprises in my more than 30 years of being a writer and a researcher and a curator has been to work on projects related to Calder Circus. I've done it 3 times, always in collaboration. The first was the show that Jed mentioned, Alexander Calder of the Paris years, 1926 to 1933, and that began because two museum directors wanted to do a show of Calder's early work. One was the Whitney, Adam Weinberg, director of the Whitney, and the other museum director was Alfred Packman at Centre Pompidou. And to their great credit, they didn't just compete with each other, they decided to collaborate. And this was really important since the early years, the formative years for Calder, are in Paris. The circus is made there from 26 to 31, even though he's going back and forth. And by the time he comes back in 1933, the Mobile is born. The circus has been part of the Whitney's collection. It's one of the most important, a keystone in the museum's collection. And it's a work that is so beloved by visitors. Many people say that it was the first work of art that really got them hooked on looking at art and becoming lifelong museum goers. The second project grew out of the first, and it was a study, a conservation study sponsored by the Getty, funded by the Getty, and it was a team of people. Carol Mancusi-Ungaro Select, who's the associate director of research and conservation at the Whitney, chose a team, and one of them was Ellen Eleanor Nodge, who is a conservator. Another person is Anita Duquette, who's here tonight, and is an archivist and a researcher, and I was the third person, the curator and the chief researcher. And the third project grew out of the second one because we found so much new material. I mean, basically the point about the conservation study was how do you conserve something that was a performance? And not just any performance, but unlike theater, performance art is created by the artist. It can only be performed by the artist. And now that the artist is no longer alive, it can never be performed, so the objects that we have are sort of relics, and they're in arrested stages. They don't move, they can't move. So how do you give life back to something that's arrested? And how do you give a sense of what the original context of when it was made and performed and over the years changed? And also, how do you keep it in good health? What do you do to keep it the way it is? Do you repair things? Maybe yes, maybe no. One of the great things about our conservator is going back to the original documents. If the damages were okay to Calder, they're okay to us as well. Many of the repairs are made in his own hand. He sewed the costumes. If something broke during a performance, he would fix it. So the really great thing about this kind of conservation study, it says what you might do and what you don't do. And being hands-off is a really good thing. So before I show you these pictures and tell you what we found, I mean, we have enough material. We made a short film, actually, the third project. We had so many new discoveries that we made a very short film, and I think we have enough material for a feature and a couple of publications and even a new show. So one of the things you'll notice at the exhibition here that's absolutely fantastic is that there's no Calder Circus there at all. It never leaves the museum, except on very, very rare occasions, and one of the occasions was Paris. Now, I should also say it was a little bit odd initially when I was asked to be the curator. I mean, the two directors picked a curator from each of their museums, except that I rarely work on things other than modern and contemporary art. I'm known for working with people like Bruce Nauman and Ann Hamilton and Joan Jonas. And on the face of it, they have nothing to do with Calder, especially big sculptures, public sculptures, when he was first working, when they were becoming young, when they were young artists. But the most obvious thing is that they're all performers and have invented a kind of performance art, and it's clear that Calder was a very, very early maker of such things. Unlike theater, you know, the person doesn't write it, and it can't be interpreted by actors, directors. It can only be done by the artist. So, Calder in Paris. He wanted to arrive, not just physically to get to Paris, but he really did want to be known and well known, and there was a lot of press coverage. And this particular one talks about his circus could fit into a hat box. Let me see. This one Jed showed to you. This is also a Kertész, and showed how he launched his creatures into space. Time and space and movement were his materials as much as wood or cork or whatever. Also, importantly, this picture is of his hands. One of the contemporary writers in the 20s wrote that his hands were like animal paws, but people were fascinated that they could be so big and yet so delicate and controlled. Oops. So he was photographed a lot, and as you'll see, initially the circus was, he was on the ground. It was sort of, I call it one-story high. And you can see him perform. That's Fujita playing the instrument. Other people performed with him. That's one of the press clippings. This is his answer to why he lived in Paris, which is the title of it, is because in Paris, it's considered a compliment when you're called crazy. These were some of the invitations that he made, and it says there, genius of mechanical toys and is exhibiting. And the importance of the toys, Jed mentioned that there was a time in Paris when he was asked to make toys. He thought he could make money. The fellow disappeared, but he finally did make toys for an American company. And some of these actually are related to acts he'd seen in the circus. The bear, for example, is one. The kangaroo turns up in his circus. And here's the American version. It's really important to say at the very beginning, Calder moved back and forth between Paris, even shortly after he arrived, and that he was tremendously familiar with Paris from his childhood. There are letters that are really fascinating when he's in Paris where he points out places that his parents lived and where his sister was born. And these letters he would send to his parents, and they would annotate them and send to his sister Margaret, who was born in Paris. So this is how Calder transported it, initially in fewer suitcases than this, but by the time he had completed it in 5. This is him setting up the circus at the Whitney. In 1970, it went on loan. The artist generously lent it to the Whitney. That's Jean Lippman, who was a curator, and I feel like I'm following in her footsteps since I worked with the manager of Art in America for 10 years. And she'd been there for decades before that, and then did the Calder's Universe show at the Whitney. And even when I was a young person in publishing, I was the person assigned to go show her proofs, because she was supposedly intimidating. They would send the youngest on the staff. This is, one of the National Police Gazette images. And as Jeff said, he was a reporter. He was doing these scenes from New York. And we always thought that after Calder started inventing his circus, he was no longer a reporter. This picture was a gift to his sister and brother-in-law. And, it's a typical ringling. Ringling at the time could be 3 rings, it could be 5 rings, and it's one of the things we'll talk about later is the difference between the French circuses and the American circuses. But in this gift to his sister and brother-in-law, he said that maybe I can use one of these things. He said that this low wire performer was his sister, doing the Charleston on the wire, that these 3 were his nephews, and the guy with the bat was his brother-in-law. You'll see later some of the acts that Calder did. I'll point out this center act of May Worth. He did the elephants that you saw in the clip that Jed showed from the Jean Penlevé film. So this is Calder's ringmaster, but it's important to remember that many of the names of the characters, if they do have a name, are related to him being in France. I mean, the original title of the circus was Le Cirque Calder, and the English title followed. And this fellow is known as Monsieur Royal, which is the name all of the ringmasters have in Paris circuses. This is the Whitney show, the Paris Year show, and a couple of things were discovered in the research. We were able to see a lot of documents and films in Paris. The Penlevé film was discovered at the time. Nothing compares to the archive at the Calder Foundation for documents, artworks, letters, and the expertise of Sandy Rower. It's the foundation's director. What we found and decided to do with this installation was when we looked in storage, we found many, many parts of the circus that hadn't been identified. There were sticks, there were little wooden platforms, there were little wire gizmos, and no one had quite figured out what they were. Certain traditional circus parts were always shown. And what we found in looking at the early films and looking at early photographs by Kertész and Brassai and many others was that we could figure out how this went together. So for the first time we showed the circus 2 stories tall. And often the circus had been just shown as an array of characters. And what we did here was to put the characters who played together in an act back together, because he performed them very precisely, one act after another. And we put the devices and the carpets and the things that he made them use to make them move. And the other thing we did, since they don't move, is to show films of, so you could have a kind of a bifocal view. You could see this act, you could see this act with the horseback riding lady, and but you could also see it, you could have look down and see that act performed there. And because we anticipated big crowds, we also played it in a very big screen above so people could see it from afar. And I don't know if you can see it, but on the left were the toys that he made, and on the right were some of the sculptures that he made. So you can see that white painted panel with the orange was how he got the elephant to stand up. You could see in the clip that Jed showed, this was moving in circle. What else was in that clip? Nothing else there. I should say something else about the installation that was very subtle, but because it was a performance, we did something that the public probably didn't know, but it really changed how it was perceived. And the great theatrical lighting designer, Jennifer Tipton, lit the circus. And she lit two other parts of the show as well. And what she did here was, it was very subtle, but there was a computer-controlled spotlight, a very subtle spotlight that moved from act to act, so you only focused on one act at a time, but without calling attention to itself. She also lit the Josephines that were all suspended, and she lit the wire heads that greeted you on a wall, that were suspended like belay rumbles, and that brought their shadows down to visitors' eye level, because they were really installed so high so that no one could touch them, but you didn't get that sense. So here's some of the characters, the Wild West Act. Now, keep in mind that there's only one white horse of all of the elements, and there are hundreds and hundreds of elements in the circus. So, he would use the horse for the cowboy and cowgirl act. He would use the horse for this act of the horseback rider, a bareback rider. And I should say that while there are no circus figures in this show, starting on December 22nd, there will be some circus figures on view at the Whitney in a show called American Legends from Calder to O'Keefe. And I'm told the final decisions aren't made, they're installing it right now, that the cowboy will be in it, and the horse and the bareback rider will be used, and the acrobats and the ringmaster and the strongman, and there'll be other works by Calder, a very large mobile and stable, and also one of the heads of Edgar Varese, the wire heads portraits that he did when he was in Paris. Well, this is, from the first show, or the show, probably one of the most important discoveries, because in storage we found, I guess I should show you, these two little copper things. One was flat, one was curved, and typically the restorer might think that the flat one was the wrong one, they couldn't decide. And we found this little wire thing that's attached from the middle to the rider. And of course we saw the carpet, and underneath there's a crank that Calder turns, that turns this one. So to make the act work, and we saw this in a film, he attaches the little wire with that wheel to the rider, so that when she goes around, the wheel that's attached to her goes over that curve, she jumps up, and the rope goes between her and the horse. It's just incredible. Calder turns one hand, turns the crank with one hand and holds the other end of the rope with the other. So we know who this rider is. She was in that scene in the circus with Sandy Calder from the National Police Gazette, and she's identified there. It says, "Back to the horses, back," says "Dainty Miss Mayworth." Well, what we discovered in the second project, when we started to research the films and the documents and what happened in the circus, and the real big surprise, we thought Calder had stopped reporting, and what we realized was, as he was inventing the circus, he was reporting on it in a new way. So there's Mayworth with her distinctive bow that Calder's little figure has, and there she is again. And we actually have, I mean, the first discovery on that second round of looking at the early films was to actually see Mayworth performing the act that we had seen in Calder's Circus. So of course that set off another search. I would call Anita and say, "You won't believe this." And she would find the actual footage and get it for us, and then we'd find another, and then we'd find another, and then we started to look at the posters, and we found more information. This was an act, again, that we could identify through films. You know, but it had never really been exhibited with the circus before, because no one knew what to make of it. They were called the clothespin ladies, and we could see, certainly in the Jean Penlevé film, that, well, 4 seasons, we knew the little writing in Calder's hand, and the characters went together. This turned around, a curtain would drop, and then you'd see it change to the 3 graces. And then the curtain would drop again, and you would see dawn and dusk. I mean, these are basically, most of the clothespins are painted white, some brown, with little tiny dots for breasts. And this one is Paul Revere. I mean, it really made no sense to people as they were looking, what did this have to do with the circus? I mean, it wasn't an aerialist, it wasn't a clown, it wasn't horseback riding. Well, it turned out that one of the main acts at the time in Ringley's circus were these tableaux vivants, where people in white body paint or white costumes or leotards, or bronze ones, were living sculptures. And as it says at the bottom, chaste and classic poses showing the chiseled wonders of the world's master sculptors. And then we found this Kelpie photograph that shows it in 5 rings, these living tableaux. This you saw in the clip that Jed chose, and it was another puzzling one. Why did he have Pegasus in the middle of the circus? Again, and it's much bigger than the other ones. And then, I mean, it's fascinating. We all love this one, with the little dogs running inside and outside the wheel. It's just a brilliant engineering feat. And then we saw this. So, it says, for the first time in America, Madame Bradma's new novel act, Most Wonderful Horses and Greatest Acting Dogs Ever Seen Combined in a Performance. Peerless. And obviously, Madame Bradma's dogs ran in and out of the wheels, just as he did. And one of the horses is, the actual horses, is part of the act. Now, Fred Bradma was actually the ringmaster at Ringling during this time, and he was also the manager, the equestrian manager. She also had a bird act with pigeons, and that kind of gives us a clue to this act by Calder with the fluttering birds of paper, and this is the one that Miro loved so much. This is the first character that we know was French, but sometimes the names of the characters are kind of general. He's called the strong man, but then sometimes he's called Rigolo, and we know he is Charles Rigolo, who was the strongest man in the world. And this is a brass-eye sequence of photos that show Rigolo lifting his barbells, and there he is, l'homme plus fort du monde. Now this was another character that really puzzled us. I adore him. He's always called the little clown. We saw it in the clip. He smokes, he blows up the balloon, he knocks over the bearded lady. And again, you see Calder's hand. I mean, not just the hair and the costume, but the hairy legs. And it was always puzzling, why did he make this character with legs like that? So here he is about to, Calder will come, take the horn out of his, the tube and put the cigarette in, and then there's the bearded lady, and then he'll knock over the bearded lady, and again, that's another view of him from the back. And there's the bearded lady from that National Police Gazette, and here he is again. Now, if you look at the upper right, well, I'll tell you a little bit of a story. Calder, was friends with the Fratellini, the famous Fratellini clowns, who had come to see him perform. And in our research of looking at Ringling, we saw a film that the Ringling clowns went to a hospital in New York, I think it was Bellevue, and performed. So of course you think, well, if the clowns were performing in New York, maybe the clowns were doing a similar thing in Paris, and found a film. And in this film of the Fratellini's visiting hospital, we saw that Albert Fratellini rolls up one leg of his trousers and has these weird rubber tubes, like big hairy legs. And if you can see, I don't know if you can really see it here, but there's Albert Fratellini, and there were two sisters, Marta and Juliette Vesk, who documented the circus from, I think it was 1904 to 1940, in 23 notebooks and watercolors. And one of the details they have of all of the pictures of Albert are his strangely hairy legs. So, and there he is again, even if he's in costume. So one of the things we realized is when Calder got to Paris, he started to take particular attributes of a clown or a character and not a whole act necessarily. He so liked, the Fratellini so liked him and Calder so liked the Fratellinis that they asked if they could, one of them, Albert, was known for dragging along what looked like a dead dog, but it wasn't a dog. So he asked Calder to make him a rubber dog, like the little Mr. Barra in the circus. And this is particularly funny because it's obviously, there's the dog, and there's Albert Fratellini. But Calder annotated his scrapbook by saying Chien de Calder, to be sure that everyone knew it was his dog because it's not mentioned in the caption. This is the Fratellinis writing to Calder to say that their dog, the dog had gone to Germany with them. He was a big success. He got a little bit sick, but they gave him some whiskey and he seemed to be doing better. Now, one of the odd things and wonderful things about Calder's circus is the circus at the time, the Ringling Circus and other circuses, there was a big divide between the main tent shows that were high class, elegant, the ideal bodies, and the sideshow and the midway, where it was bodies that were manipulated, tortured, sometimes abnormal in size or in, the fat lady, sometimes they were called freaks of, the Siamese twins. Well, Calder took the sideshow sword swallower, let's say, and the hoochie coochie dancer, Fanny, and we're not sure, Fanny could be any number of things. There was a Cirque Fanny in Paris. He obviously liked her bottom, Fanny, and there also was an elephant named Fanny at the Ringling Circus. And we know when he visited the circus in Florida, he knew the names of the elephants and so forth. But this is one of the most wonderful characters in the circus. Now, he brought the hoochie coochie dancer into the main tent, and if you look at this body next to the living statues that were mimicking marble or bronze, he also played with that too by making those elegant bodies just plain clothespins. So, as far as we know, there are some exceptions, and the films are some of the exceptions. Calder always started the circus with the ringmaster, and he was the voice and blew the whistle, as you saw. This is Fred Bradma, who was the ringmaster at the time. And he ended it with the chariot race, as the Ringling Circus did. It's another view of it, shot differently. And again, there you can see it in the 20s. This article is written by Kiki de Montparnasse. And in the caption it calls him, he's known in the art colony as the Wire Man. And in other writings he's called King of Wire and String. And now, Calder's performance. I said earlier that I mostly work with contemporary artists. And actually catalog resume. I've done 2 books about Anne Hamilton, one about her performances and installations, and one about the objects that came out of them. And I think all of these things sort of help me address Calder. What do you do with a performance, and how do you document it, and what do you do with the elements that live on? This is from the New York Times, and it's on view at the Armory right now. And what I found surprising, thinking that these performers had nothing in common with each other, Calder, when I started to pull out a couple of images, you realize that Calder is in the DNA of any performance artist who is using time and motion and themselves in their work. So people, not to mention swing and being suspended, but you can see this, it's on view now. That's Anne Hamilton. This is Joan Jonas, and the same thing of trying to get away from gravity, whether it's suspending a person on a wall or the lamps that she invented. This is part of a new piece called Reanimation that was seen at Documenta, and that will have a performance probably be in Performa next year. Also, the whole idea of just drawing with this, just a line to elicit a character and make it almost invisible, make things weightless. This is Naumann performing his self-portrait as a fountain. And this, when I actually went to look for one picture by Naumann, which is a suspended rectangle with a chair in the middle, but then I realized he's suspended things like Calder his whole career. This was called the 100 Fish Fountain. This is called Diamond Africa, with the chair tuned to D-E-A-D. The legs are actually tuned to those notes. This is called Shitting Your Head on a Chair. These are self-portraits and others that were in Venice. He did it with taxidermied animals, he did it with heads, he did it with hands. And this is him performing early on square, walking in contrapposto, and of course trying to defeat gravity, just the way Calder did. So thanks.
I mean, the thing that occurs to me, listening to you after me, is how Calder the Circus, he's so close to some of these things, these amazing connections you've made, and at the same time he's so far away. I mean, he's absorbing all this stuff from the world, the bow, particular configurations, and yet he's abstracting it at the same time.
Yeah, he's extracting and literally abstracting elements that would speak and tell the story. That tiny figure of the horse of May Worth, yeah. He doesn't call her May Worth, but at the time you would have recognized that pink bow as her. I mean, one of the things I find fascinating is the film that you showed, the Jean Painlevé film. Painlevé saw the Circus performed in Paris, but didn't make in the 20s, but didn't make his film till 1955, even though it's called the Cirque Calder 1927. But the really fascinating thing about Painlevé is that he was the first underwater photographer way before Jacques Cousteau, and he believed and he wrote that science is fiction. And he was known for this very slow, careful attention to seahorses and underwater creatures, and I think he brought that attention to the way he filmed Calder. But I think it's really fascinating. Maybe you want to talk about his training as an engineer. I think that's important. I also think that he loved to dance, and that's important. And how they're not segregated in his science and fiction and inventing are not separate.
I mean, we're talking about a creative imagination, and in a creative imagination, many different things are active and alive at the same time. I think that's, and you're right. I mean, Calder himself said that he talked about how key the solar system was to the mobiles. But one thing I've been thinking a lot recently is that I think the idea of family relationships, for instance, are also very key to mobiles. And it's interesting, you're talking about in the painting from 1926, how different people in the painting he's connecting with members of his family. I think any kind of array of groupings and relationships between, and the fluidity of relationships, whether it's planets in the solar system, or the way friends and family interact, or the way people move on a dance floor. I mean, I think all these things are there in his imagination, and I mean, originality comes from allowing those things to interweave and interconnect in ways that the artist, him or herself, doesn't even understand until they're realized in the work.
One thing I think is important, and I've always been surprised, I was surprised when I came across these things in the archive. Many people write about, including Calder's sister, about the 3 generations of Calders, and talk about the male line. But I remember being fascinated to find out that both Calder's father and mother had the same training in Philadelphia, and both independently went to Paris, and then came back, both worked at the academy, and then after they married, went back to Paris. But I think if I could make a recommendation for your biography is to add her in a little bit more.
She's a huge figure in the biography.
I think her paintings are wonderful.
Her paintings are wonderful. She's also, I mean, some people here know this, have heard me talk about this. Nanette Lederer Calder, who came from Milwaukee, was in fact an important figure in feminist art circles in Philadelphia in the 1890s. And I mean, and indeed, when you think about Calder, when he finally decides to embrace a career in art, he first embraces his mother's art form.
And she gives him the materials.
Yes, and she's very, very supportive. And then he sort of backs his way into sculpture, as I see it. And I think the circus is part of the way he does that. I have to say that the question of how one characterizes circus, I am made a little uneasy by applying the term performance art to the circus, because I think it's kind of a retroactive term, and my feeling is that Calder made a very clear distinction between this and between performances of the circus and the things he exhibited in galleries and museums. And when you consider that until the late 60s, the circus was never exhibited in a static form.
Oh, I wasn't calling him a performance artist as now, but the things that he did and the way he did it also apply now. But he wasn't alone in performing. I mean, people, all of the Surrealist theater and people like Pamela Vey projected films while people were performing. He was part of a milieu. Other people performed in a different way. Other artists had puppet theaters. He had this, and he was a barker for his own, a circus barker, if you will, to get people into the studio. They had to pass and see his other things as they came in, and he really did become known.
I mean, I sometimes wonder how many people actually saw the circus totally before it was exhibited.
Many.
Well, how many? I don't know. I mean, what... Sandy Rower, who knows more about this than I mean, how many people would you say total saw the circus in all the performances from 26 to 61?
Well, as you know, we have so few documented
Right.
performances. So a few dozen performances, 30 people.
Right. I mean, so in a way, the Whitney has altered the complexion of what, I mean, the circus is something seen by many, many people now.
Well, I think Calder was the first one who altered it, because he was the one that lent the object, so we have to
Right,
go
right,
back.
no, but I'm
to
saying
the
that's in, I mean, and that's after he stops performing it.
Right,
I
it's about 10 years,
Yeah.
about 10 years afterward.
I mean, performances, as I understand it, were often given, when he would have a show, either a patron or, I think, did Pierre Matisse have shows at his apartment? Was there ever a show? I mean there, around the time of a show, there would be a performance or performances that a few dozen people would be invited to.
But he also hired out in New York, and there were ads in the New Yorker where he would perform them for society dinners and evenings. I mean, it was a part of his life, it was a
Right,
part of
right.
his thinking, part of his making, whether he considered it apart from his sculpture or... Look, when I look at the career, he never stopped making things. So I don't really, I mean, I feel good to be here in the middle of the Bard Center, because they don't make a distinguish between decorative arts and crafts and sculpture and painting. The same thought, his conceptual strength is in, it's in all of the different mediums. So I don't really like, making names, but in fact, in Paris, puppet theater is everywhere. I mean, and it doesn't even have to, marionettes are not just puppets on strings, they're puppets where there's a...
I would agree with you completely that there is a flow through in Calder from when he's, I mean, when he has the major show at the Museum of Modern Art in 1943, it starts by showing something he did when he was 10 or 11 years old, a tiny little dog he did. I mean, there's definitely a sense of a flow through, whether he's doing a latch for a cabinet in the house in Connecticut, or he's doing a sculpture, a mobile to hang in the stairway at the Museum of Modern Art. There's definitely a flow through in the interaction with materials. But I think at the same time, he's an artist who has a very distinct sense of different modes and occasions. I mean, I think he even has that. I think he regards a big stabile for a public place in a very different way he regards a little table sculpture. I mean, I think there are different modes and ways of expressing what I would agree is a
But it's very
similar-
interesting. I recently talked to Carlos Villardebo, who made the other film, and who really talked about the same. He actually picked up a small Calder mobile that was given to him by Calder, and the same principle, the scale is correct to that size, whether it's small or large. I mean, I'm fascinated by the fact that he could work in all of these mediums, including jewelry, including, the latches for the houses, including making designs for tapestries, for doing theater things.
I have to say, in terms of what the circus felt like to the first people who saw it. I mean, when you read Andre Legrand's accounts of knocking on the door, and this tall, young American who's fascinated, Legrand obviously, answers the door and sitting on the bed in this little room, and he describes Calder sort of pulling things out of places. First of all, we don't even know what he was showing in those, right? It's not, as I understand it, it's not clear exactly, if you're looking at the first couple of years, which things
Well,
were...
Legrand Chabier wrote several articles
Right, no, I
about
know,
it,
but I'm saying...
and reviewed them in performance. So
Right.
I think it's really interesting to look at the context of the other things that are reviewed in those newspapers,
Yeah.
because Circus was considered not just a popular entertainment, but
There's a kind of
kind of-
connoisseurship of these these are high. I mean, I use the word high popular entertainments. I think there's a connoisseurship of these kind of entertainment. Look, all the artists went to the Cirque. I mean, talking all the artists went. So there's a connoisseurship of it. But I think it takes a leap of the imagination now, and to grasp what it all felt like at first. I think
probably
it
was a part. It felt like a party.
Well, when Legrand Chabier, the first time he went, there was only like 3 people or something. I mean, it was tiny, it felt like a kind of strange discovery, and I think it wasn't clear quite what it was.
Well, people thought that when you read the reviews, they're sometimes called toys.
Right.
Sometimes people write, they don't know what these things are, but they're Calders. One of the things that, the more, believe me, I have gotten so hooked on this, the more I find out about it, the more I realize how much he's in the DNA of any contemporary artist, of the kind of issues. I saw a film last week in Paris of a documentary about Anna Halprin, San Francisco postmodern choreographer. It's about the whole history of postmodern dance. And there's a point in the film where she says, and I have to get it right, she doesn't say Calder's sculptures are like a dancer. She says the reverse. She says, dancing is like a Calder sculpture. Where one thing happens and then in response something else happens. There was another thing of a lecture of trance music and visual art, and that went from Glenn Gould to rock and roll performers to actually a piece by Anna Halpern. And in this, there was a Belgian critic talking about jazz in the 1950s, and whoever made this film, we don't know who made it, in the back is a Calder shadow, so that someone is telling the story about jazz and using these changing shadows. Your idea about the shadow theater, and I'm really surprised at how much not just artists continue to make circus works. There's many of them, or films, but the whole idea of time and movement and suspension and release. I was really surprised when I found those other images, because I was expecting to find one or two by each of these people, and I thought,
Well, you have to remember, Duchamp and Arp, there are other people working with movement and randomness and those kinds of surprise, even before Calder at the same
but not
time.
multiple movement. That his great innovation was to make multiple movements at the same time. Many other people had motored one part of a sculpture or floated a sculpture, but how he could choreograph movement.
Well, it's interesting. Calder started by doing mechanized moving sculptures, and he didn't like the mechanisms because they were too rigid. I have to say, I don't think any in the history of kinetic art since Calder, I have to say, I don't think anybody has come close to Calder when it comes to creating a movement that is both controlled, in the sense that there's a limited number of things that a mobile can do. Yet within that control, there is what feels like, as you watch a mobile move, an almost, what seems like an almost limitless number of possibilities between what is a controlled movement. And I mean, in a strange way, despite his audaciously experimental spirit, there is to me something of the classicist about Calder. There's always a completion. There's a sense that it flows through and it completes.
I think he discovered something that neurologists have found, which is that there's a fascination and a satisfaction of quickly unpredictable movements, whether it's watching fire or other things like that. And that engagement is not just about passively looking at something. You are physically, your eyes, your whole nervous system is changing when this thing is changing.
That's physics, and he studied physics at Stevenson. Should we open? Do you want to?
Yeah, questions.
Do you want to,
Sorry.
Okay.
do you want?
Calder's Circus was done with the smallest possible scale, with a limited audience, and however wonderful they are, I think he's famous, well known for the immense sculptures that he's doing or has done, which are in major spaces, and the mobile, and I think he's fantastic. But the fact is that he moved through, And what he's known for is not
Well, I think for me what's interesting is that the circus is a catalyst for those ideas that are in the mobiles.
yeah.
And the other interesting thing is, after he stopped making it, when he becomes internationally famous for mobiles, stabiles, big commissions, he continues to perform it.
Maybe you're right.
So it had, I mean, this is an unknown question, it had some other meaning. I don't know the answer to it, I'm curious about it, but he performed it the night before his wedding, he went to Miro in Spain and performed it, he would travel and...
Well, but you're talking about the early 30s before I mean, at that point he's famous in a small avant-garde, I mean, he's very famous in a small avant-garde circle. He's not yet famous in the way we think of
No.
fame.
Well,
today.
when you see the newspaper clippings, they're in Swedish, in Russian, in French, in Spanish. I mean, he had his own clipping agency. He really wanted to become famous.
But I would say that, I mean, I think it's wrong to see the scale as going in one way. I mean, one of the things I have to say I love about Calder is that it isn't a kind of one track down the road kind of career. He continues to do extraordinarily small, intimate things all the way through. He also never, the career is theme and variations, and it's funny if you don't know the dates of things very well, you look at something which has very simplified spheres, and you think, oh well, that must be 30s, and it'll turn out it's 50s actually. Once he gets to around 1940, he has this very rich repertoire of kinds of images, and at the end of his life, he brings back comic caricatural figures actually and elements that recall the stuff. There'll be some mobiles where almost all the elements are abstract, but there'll be a clown head in the middle of it. And so he's always doing one thing and then another thing. He's never a one-track artist, which is for me one of the things I really, really admire about him. I mean, he has the kind of richness and variety of a human imagination. He has a yearning toward absolute simplicity. And then he has interest in doing very complicated, intricate things. He does stark, very, you might say, dark things. And then he'll do, at almost at the same time, witty, intimate, light things. And it's as if there are different sides to who he is, which I think is part of what's so interesting about him.
I think also one of the interesting things, given that we're doing this in relation to the circus and the history of the circus in New York, is the profound difference between Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey, 5-ring, 3-ring circus, noisy, brash, and the Paris 1-ring circus, which...
Or the Big Apple Circus.
That's
Apple.
Excuse me, speaking up.
Sure.
No, but that's our hometown circus. And
Right.
I've been on that board for 30 years.
Uh-huh.
So,
Yeah.
Well, maybe talk about that in relation to...
well, I think that's the beauty and the intimacy of that circus, and the great contrast with Ringling Brothers. And I think that's what he felt
Mm.
and expressed.
Well,
I
one-
didn't mean to speak up, but I just
No,
wanted
no,
to...
it's great.
Speak
When
up,
you said
please.
the parent circus, we have Big Apple Circus right here,
For the past
Doing-
40, 30 years, yeah.
35.
35. I was thinking 40, 30, I couldn't remember how many.
Right?
But one of the things about and I think it's in the Big Apple Circus too, in the French circus, the clowns spoke, talked. There was a very quiet sense of relationship of the performer to the audience. And from the very beginning in Ringling, it was loud and big band music and a lot going on. And he does, his drawing changes when he draws the circus in the early 30s. After he stops making the characters for the circus, he keeps drawing the circus.
And then,
I was wondering about his work in wire during this period, when he's performing the circus and he's simultaneously the king of wire. I'm not familiar that aside from the dog that he made for his circus friends, you might think that he would do larger wire circus figures.
He did.
Like he did with Josephine Baker. He did.
He did. Like the Brass Family is a very big multi-figure piece.
Did you do many of them?
You're saying they could be performed, actually?
No, not
Oh.
that.
No, as sculptures, wire
Like-
sculptures.
Like the Leger portrait head or a Miro portrait
He
head.
did many wire portraits of friends and colleagues.
But he didn't do like the ringmaster or like some of the acrobats in large size.
He did do some of the acrobats, he did. And he did, there's like a shop sign, that's a woman upside down, holding a sign that says Calder Circus.
And I know he did a few in bronze that are currently on view, I think, at the L&M show of elephants and
I'm sorry, didn't he do a series of heads or busts which were open wire and which were depended also on lights so that there was an interplay between actually the wire and the shadow which was right behind it?
Yeah,
Which were-
and they're incredibly evocative portraits.
Nice.
Of Miro, of Velez, of Arp, I mean, they're just, they're so economical and you really feel the presence of what these people were like.
I mean, I would just say, I mean, there's a shift when, I mean, the wire sculptures come out of, I mean, the circus, I think I'm right in saying the beginning of the circus, sort of slightly perhaps before the beginning of most of the wire sculpture that we know, okay? I mean, and I mean, when he does a group of circus performers in wire sculpture, I think the issues are different. He's then doing a static image, if you will, I mean a literally static image, that is meant to be regarded as a work of sculpture, has always been regarded, to be looked at in a certain way. It's a very different thing than these elements that are meant to be manipulated in a performance. And I think he pulls
But
out
there's some other sculptures. There's one at the Calder Foundation where in scale it's an intermediary, it has a painted base. It has wire
yes, the circus
for
yeah, right,
the
yeah.
circus scene.
Right, yeah.
There are people balancing each other. They're preparing. Someone's sitting, on a piece of the ring.
But I mean, I think he's isolating at that point aspects of the circus that he then feels he can make into works of art that are going to be regarded in a different way. I mean, the circus performers were never meant to be for somebody to be sitting there and looking at it in a static form. They weren't meant to, they were taken out of a suitcase and they were moved around in front of people.
They're fun. One question that I've had is, when you look at some of the early photographs, there are some dolls that are isolated from the circus. I mean, can we ask Sandy a question?
Please, Sandy should be running this.
Why do you
This
think?
is Sandy Rower, the president of the Calder Foundation, a grandson of.
Why do you think
Thanks.
Calder?
And a fantastic guy, totally fantastic. And I mean it.
Now, you've done more research on the circus than just about anybody. And what do you think the compelling factor? Why did it sustain him so long in his life? What was it about? I mean, from your point of view.
Well, first of all, I think it's amazing and fantastic that both of you have taken such a deep look at things, Jed, going back to all this stuff and going back to things I never even thought of or heard of, or finding. So Mr. Pearl here, going back and discovering so much that was going on in my great-grandmother's family and my great-everybody family and so forth. It's fascinating and wonderful, and dragging Calder back to 1860 instead of beginning Calder post-engineering school. Everyone thinks Calder was an engineer who became an artist, which is absurd and backwards. It's sort of like your postmodern choreographer, with the ballet, the dance, and the moga. But my grandfather really stopped performing the circus when he became abstract. So in October 1930, he moved away from the circus. It was a big chore to perform the circus. It took hours to be on your knees for hours. It was a big chore. When he, for Jean Benlivet in 1955, to make that film that we saw at the little clip, the whole movie is about an hour. And it's a document, and they shot it over days. He was on his knees for days. He was taking homeopathic Ornica to reduce the swelling in his knees. It was a terrible situation for him. But Penny suggested to document the circus because, as he points out, only the few people that had seen the circus was, it was a few hundred people, maximum. And it would be great to have some sort of lasting document beyond the Cortez photographs, beyond the Versailles photographs. It wasn't really my grandfather's impetus to perpetuate the circus, although he did leave a drawing for his wife and his two daughters, some diagrams about how things are assembled and constructed, which, Joan, you know it, so they could continue and perform the circus one day. That was sort of his idea in 1949 to make this document. It never happened, of course. They never performed the circus. But there were a few occasions. But what's amazing for me is that someone at the Whitney noticed, the Calder Circus was always 1926 to 1930, and someone at the Whitney years ago noticed that the little hand truck that carries the barbell into the circus ring and drops it, because it's very heavy, right? You have a little hand truck to carry it in, that the wheels of the hand truck are made out of centime, French centime coins, and one of those coins is from 1931. So it was very important because we always thought it ended in 1930, so it disproved this notion and showed that Calder continued working on the circus after he became an abstract artist, a little bit after,
But didn't he also continue to draw the circus in the 30s after he became an abstract
I mean,
artist?
circus as a theme,
Yeah.
as opposed to cirque.
Oh, yeah, to not isolate the cirque, I mean.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've come to realize in thinking about Calder and his wife Louise is people talk about their love of dancing, their love of drinking. They are products of the 20s, of what we think of as the Roaring 20s. And when people talk about going to the parties in the 50s in Roxbury, what they sensed was, their Paris is the F. Scott Fitzgerald Paris. And I think, I would make the argument that the circus, the great wire sculptures of the last years of the 20s are really part of that spirit of what we think of as the F. Scott Fitzgerald 20s expatriate Paris. And I've actually come to feel that the shift to abstraction, Calder always talked about going to Mondrian's studio, but I think Calder with the crash and the arrival of the Depression, I don't think he could have continued to do what he did.
I think I disagree with you a little bit. There were many different Parises in the 20s. And there was, the literary Paris of Fitzgerald was really different than the artists of Calder's milieu, who were really different than the artists of the black artists and musicians. There was a little bit of crossover, but it was, you could live, the Fitzgeralds and their pals were really rich. In the 20s, you could live really well in Paris on very little money because of the crazy exchange rate, and it changed. But the people who were living on big trust funds left when the crash happened. Other artists stayed longer and left because of the intimations of war and what was happening here.
I'm not talking about how exactly they live, but I think the way people respond to the Calder of the late 20s, the sense people have, there's a smile on people's faces, and there's a sense of a lost moment of joy and a kind of pleasure, which was, in a sense, you could argue, the great optimism of the pre-World War I time was, for many people, erased by World War I. But then there was this hope in the 20s that somehow that was the war to end all wars. And I think the kind of champagne high that I do think is there in the wire sculptures, the lightness, the exhilaration, the quickening quality. I think it's an American view of that Parisian experience, and it could not be sustained. I don't think it could be sustained in the 30s.
Well, I think it's also part of the recovery from World War I.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
Paris was devastated. It was really poor. I think you can almost think of the kind of poor materials, inexpensive materials, as still part of that recovery. It wasn't all champagne and light. It was pretty grim for most people recovering.
Alas,
Obviously, his training as an engineer applied to his work with the wire sculpture and the circus, but after leaving engineering school, did he just continue to scratch his head and say, I don't know what I want to do? Is there a trace of any engineering work pre-circus that there's evidence of?
As a parent, I always feel when I look at Calder as a young man, as an adolescent in his early 20s, I can imagine how he drove his parents crazy, because he was a very, very brilliant kid. Okay, like he went to a special public high school in San Francisco for very bright kids. He did incredibly well, but he had a kind of happy-go-lucky, kind of non-focused attitude. So he would get great grades and he would know the answers to questions before anybody else. But then he would say, what do you want to do? He would just kind of grin and kind of like say, oh, I don't know. He would play sports even though he was terrible at them. He didn't have a proper competitive spirit. So he goes to engineering school, which, nobody quite knows what to do with him. He wants to go to college. He's been doing these marvelous things with his hands, making things. He's had workshops which his parents have encouraged since he was 8 or 9 or 10. He goes to a very fine Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, which has a very serious liberal arts curriculum to it. It's a place where middle-class people are sending kids who are, many of the graduates become sort of executives in big corporations. It's a really good place to go. And his parents think it's a good idea. And then he gets out, and my sense is by the end of the 4 years there, he does well, but my sense for various reasons is by the end of the time he knows he doesn't really want to be the kind of engineer who has a 9-to-5 job in a corporation that you're being trained to be there. And he has friends who have very successful careers like that. He spends 4 years, what I think is sort of wandering years, the lost years. He'll get a job, he'll be fired or he'll quit. His parents will find him a job with he works for Con Edison. Some fraternity brother will find him a job in the Midwest. He gets sick after a few months, comes home. His parents are obviously going crazy. He's incredibly smart. The months are ticking by. And so, when you look at the whole career, you ask about the significance of the engineering later on, it sort of feels uncanny in retrospect. Because then suddenly in the early 30s, he wants to make sculpture move. And everything he studied in these physics and mechanics courses in 1916 and 17, 12 or 14 years later.
And he does use the same language, the vectors and so forth. It's in the titles, it's in his writing. In
a late interview, what's the word, hypocycloidal? What is Sandy? In an interview with Catherine Koo or something, he says, now I've done this mobile, it's at, the Fog owns it, and it has, I can't remember, it's like hydrocycloidal curves. And you can look it up on Wikipedia. And it's a special kind of curve where it's a rotation around the main rotation. And this guy is using, in casual conversation in the 1950s or 60s, technical engineering terms. It's like how gears, you have one gear and then another gear. It's how those work. And these terms, which he learned in 1916, 17, he just knows this stuff. So, it's sort of, it really to me sometimes, as looking at the story of the life, feels uncanny that these things...
Also even in the toys, the description of how they kind of hop,
right.
Wobble, has to do with axles and the eccentric placement of wheels along the axle. So he's definitely using that knowledge to get these toys and other objects to move the way he wants them to.
Joan mentioned that he uses the word disparity. Did you said the word disparity comes up a lot in his interviews. He said the key for me is disparity. Okay. Now, if you know anything about physics, one of the key principles in physics is parity. Okay. And there's the idea that there's it's an idea of mirror images. There's a force here and there's an opposite force, and there's this kind of balance in the world. And the fact that he uses the word disparity, which is not a usual word that you hear artists, the abstract artists of the period using, I think it's a reaction, it's coming out of his physics training. It's like there's certain things in his life that are there very deep, and then they just, it's, I guess it's the luck of genius or something, that sort of these things are put in there, whereas in 1921 or 22, he's lying on the couch in Greenwich Village in his parents' apartment. His father's saying to him, damn it, if you had taken one of those jobs in engineering, you'd actually be earning a living already, and you know what you're doing. I mean, his parents, they were very sympathetic to him. At every point, they helped him. But it seemed for a while like this was all pointless, and then it's a decade later, suddenly, well, of course, he had to have it. Last question.
Jed and Joan, I was just going to say that if anyone can come back tomorrow night, we will be able to have part 2. Obviously, and fascinating.
After many years.